Just give me 1 second. Yeah, Maya, we can start. You can accept all the participants. Good luck, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I'm seeing that everyone is connecting. Good morning from this side of the world. For some people, good afternoon, good night. It's a pleasure to be connected with you today. Sorry for my voice. I am a bit sick. Welcome and thank you for being part of the GEF Global Biodiversity Framework Early Action Support Project. Welcome to this 4th webinar in our series of capacity building, integrating human rights and gender considerations into ENG-SAPs. My name is Cassandra Llosa. I'm a stakeholder engagement analyst at UNDP, and I coordinate the implementation of the project's capacity building offerings like this virtual session, this webinar. We are likely all Zoom experts now, but here are some brief reminders. If you have technical issues, to help you resolve them, send a private message, please, to Maya Garnier. She's copying all her contact information in the chat. Please do not send a message in the group chat do not get distracted with those technical problems. So your microphones will be muted to help ensure our speakers can be heard clearly. We encourage your participation. So to ask question, you have 2 options. Type your question in the Zoom chat box as they come up during the presentation or during the Q&A session, or you can virtually raise your hand in the control panel. We'll then ask you to open your microphone during the Q&A session. Finally, we have a webinar webpage where you can access today's presentations and the recordings. We will also share them by email after the series concludes. So my colleague Maya already dropped the link in the chat. So here is today's agenda. First, we will have a brief overview of the human rights elements of the early action support project that will be given by Christina Supples, Senior Project Manager at UNDP. Then we will have a presentation about integrating gender considerations into ENG-SAPs, who will be given by Kira Booth, a Program Officer at UNDP WCMC. Then we are going to have a presentation about adopting human rights approach to ENG-SAP revision that will be given by Benjamin Schachter, Human Rights Officer and Office of the Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights. And finally, we will have a presentation about incorporating consideration of local action and a whole of society approach by Dr. Terence Hayedi, Program Manager at the Global ICCA Support Initiative. So let's start with our first presentation that will be given by Christina Supples.
Hi, everyone. As Cassandra mentioned, my name is Christina Supples. I'm a Senior Program Manager at UNDP, and I'm here to provide a very brief overview of the human rights elements of the Early Action Support Project. Thank you for joining today. In its opening statement, the Convention on Biodiversity's Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework recognizes biodiversity as fundamental to human well-being, a healthy planet, and economic prosperity for all people, including living well in balance and in harmony with Mother Earth. Today, we're going to hear a lot of ways that the human rights elements are integrated throughout the Global Biodiversity Framework and how it impacts our work on the Early Action Support Project. But before we dive into those details, I wanted to emphasize that human rights considerations are embedded in our work in many other ways as well. For example, when we take a look, next slide, please. When we take a look at the Kunming-Montreal targets, Target 1 of the framework calls for conservation measures to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Target 22 calls for ensuring the full and equitable, inclusive, effective, and gender-responsive representation and participation in decision-making and access to justice and information related to biodiversity. Target 3 and the CBD Gender Plan of Action also aim to ensure gender equality in the implementation of the framework through a gender-responsive approach, where all women and girls have the equal opportunity and capacity to contribute to the 3 objectives of the convention. And additionally, CBD Decision 15/4 emphasizes the successful implementation of the framework will depend on ensuring gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and on reducing inequalities. So it's embedded throughout the Global Biodiversity Framework, this concept of human rights. Next slide, please. Around the time of the Global Biodiversity Framework adoption, there's also been a global coalescence around the human right to a healthy environment. So the GBF's acknowledgements of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment are also recognized by more than 150 countries in General Assembly Resolution 76/300, and also the Human Rights Council's Resolution 48/13. In October 2021, the UN Human Rights Council recognized for the first time this right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. And then building on that, in July 2022, the UN General Assembly recognized for the first time the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And it also affirmed that this requires the full implementation of multilateral environmental agreements under the principles of international environmental law. Regional agreements also came into form around this time, such as the 2018 Escazú Agreement, which was the first environmental treaty in Latin America and the Caribbean aimed at protecting the right of every single person, present and future, to have a healthy environment and to sustainable development. So you're seeing, like I mentioned, not just these trends emerging more solidly in the global biodiversity framework, but also this is building on trends in global agreements related to sustainable development and nature over the past few years. So each party commits to ensuring the right, as well as others universally recognized human rights, the right to nature, healthy environment. Next slide, please. Just wanted to let you know that one thing these agreements all have in common is the recognition to exercise this human right. And that includes the right to seek, receive, and impart information, to participate effectively in the conduct of government and public affairs, and that the right to exercise all of these activities is vital to the protection of a clean and healthy and sustainable environment. So with that background, I hope you have an understanding why human rights are being emphasized in this project. Next slide, please. I just wanted to very briefly orient you to some of the key human rights elements of the Early Action Support Project, and then you'll hear from our speakers more about those topics. So as you're familiar, the EAS project provides technical and financial support to GEF-eligible parties to implement early action on the GBF. There are 2 primary activities related to gender and human rights, and those are stakeholder engagement using a whole of government or whole of society approach, and also a focus on gender and a gender action plan. And these concepts are integrated throughout the 4 components of the project. Next slide, please. I think we just went over this, but in terms of the human rights elements of the EAS project, there's guidance and capacity building available to parties on stakeholder engagement, social and environmental screening principles and procedures, and also grievance and redress mechanisms, and that exists both for UNDP and UNEP supported countries. Next slide, please. That ensures that the process that parties are following to update the national biodiversity targets is inclusive. So in terms of the contributions and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities in this project, we want to emphasize that it considers the involvement of all key stakeholders, including Indigenous peoples and local communities. The rights knowledge, including traditional knowledge associated with biodiversity, innovations, and practices of Indigenous people and local communities must be respected and considered in this project. And BSAPs will require future projects to apply a more stringent social, or sorry, I shouldn't say the NBSAPs, but the GEF projects will require the application of more stringent social and environmental safeguards in the future to ensure the risks on Indigenous people and local communities are mitigated. Next slide, please. When we consider stakeholders, what you're seeing on this slide are examples of stakeholders that could be engaged in this process. Please note that this list is not exhaustive and that additional stakeholders could be relevant. Most obviously, national ministries, CBD focal points for the CBD protocols, GEF operational focal points, and the responsible authority for the MBSAPs are key actors to include. However, there's also the encouragement in the CBD decisions and this project of a broader, excuse me, a broader range of stakeholders using that whole of government or whole of society approach. So we're looking at finance ministries, other sectors that are supportive or dependent on nature, research and academic bodies, business and industry, the IPLCs as mentioned, forestry, fisheries, other sectors that have a stake in nature, bodies and agencies responsible for addressing sustainable development, poverty eradication, youth, the media, and others. In the case of this project specifically, these stakeholders can be part of steering committees or expert groups that are formed to monitor implementation of the project, but most importantly, during the revision and update of national biodiversity targets. Next slide, please. And this is the stakeholder work was a reminder for many. I know it's a huge part of the work that's happening now around the world, mobilizing stakeholders, starting to do the NBSAP target alignment. Just wanted to throw up a definition related to gender mainstreaming. UN Women defines gender mainstreaming as the process of assessing gendered implications for women and men of any planned actions, including legislation, policies, or programs in all areas and all levels. So I think we're all aware that successful implementation of the GBF, especially with its embedding throughout the decision, will depend on ensuring gender equality and empowerment of women and girls and on reducing those inequalities. We'll be hearing more about this today, but when a gender lens is not adopted and when we do not account for the knowledge and contribution of both women and men, there are missed opportunities and limited achievement in national and global goals. Just to emphasize, gender is not a women problem. It means that to achieve better goals more efficiently with longer and more positive outputs, we need the work and the accounting of both women and men and their efforts. This project has support to all parties to ensure gender responsive and socially inclusive approach to NBSAP update, including recommendations for the inclusion of women and women's groups. Lastly, I just wanted to reference that the project does have, next slide please, a gender action plan with gender sensitive indicators. We just want to make sure that everyone's aware of that because we will be collecting this data. It also it supports women's participation and the targeted integration of gender equality considerations into the GEF-EAS project with a focus on helping to achieve target 22 and 23 and the CBD's gender action plan. Next slide, please. Just shows some examples of the project's indicators related to gender. It's steps such as ensuring that the relevant types of women's groups are engaged in an inclusive whole of government approach, ensuring there's opportunities for gender responsiveness and monitoring systems, and ensuring that gender equality considerations are mainstreamed in the alignment process. So we'll be working with you to collect information on how you're doing that, which is always really interesting to learn about. Last slide, I think we're very quickly just flashing up the gender action plan so you're familiar with it and it's not a surprise when you're collecting this information. And then last, I just wanted to share some resources on the next slide that are available. to help you continue this work. UNDP is releasing a publication very shortly in October on gender equality and women's empowerment in NBSAPs. We also have the Global Gender and Environment Outlook published by UNEP. We will be releasing this fall a self-paced course that you can take on gender equity and women's empowerment. We also have webinars such as this. And then we can support you with guidance and tools related to the Gender Plan of Action for the project as well. With that, thank you so much to for your attendance. I want to turn it over to our speakers so that they can go much more in depth on these topics. They're really important parts of the project. It's an honor to get to work on a human rights-based approach to the environment, and we look forward to this being one of many conversations about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. So as she said, we are going to continue with the presentations, and maybe if you have some questions about her presentation, we can discuss around it in the Q&A session. So let's continue with the next presentation on integrating gender considerations into NBSAPs, given by Kira Booth, who is a program officer at UNEP WCMC. So over to you, Kira.
Good day. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I think we can go straight to the next slide. So in this session, we're going to explore some of the practical ways for integrating gender equality considerations into NBSAPs. And we'll start by providing a brief background regarding the mandate for integrating gender equality in NBSAPs from decisions adopted at CBD COP15, a brief recap on those. And the content of this presentation is based on guidance and resources available on the CBD website. Next slide, please. So let's start with the CBD COP decisions, a quick refresh on those. We can go to the next slide. So regarding the gender-specific elements of the framework, Section C of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, Decision 15/14, highlights that the successful implementation of the framework will depend on ensuring gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, and on reducing inequalities. And of course, as we just heard, the framework also includes two ambitious gender-specific targets, Target 22 and Target 23. Next slide, please. Regarding the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Package, other key decisions relating to gender equality that are relevant to the NBSAP process are the Gender Plan of Action, Decision 15/11, and the Enhanced Multidimensional Approach to Planning, Monitoring, Reporting, and Review, which is Decision 15/6, which specifically encourages parties to apply the Gender Plan of Action in all aspects and at all scales of planning, implementation, reporting, and review related to the framework. Next slide, please. So the Gender Plan of Action includes a specific objective on integrating gender and human rights into NBSAPs, and the gender plan also includes specific actions related to NBSAPs. And the slide in front of us provides a summary of the key elements included in these actions. Next slide, please. So here before us, we have key considerations that could help to ensure alignment with the Gender Action Plan and the gender-specific targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework that I'm now going to talk about in more detail. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the national strategy and the process and contents of it, next slide, please. The first step is to consider institutional structures and capacities. So in this slide, we have provided a non-exhaustive list of entities and individuals that can help to ensure that the process and content of the national strategy is gender responsive and in alignment with other national gender-related policies. So some examples are including Ministry of Women's Affairs or equivalent institution in the NBSAP Steering Committee, and including gender experts who can provide advice to the National Project Manager who have the relevant academic and professional backgrounds. It's also important to plan for gender balance, and this means equal representation of women and men in the different bodies, consultations, and workshops that are set up for the development of the national strategy. Next slide, please. So the next step is conducting a gender responsive and stock-taking assessment. So this will help to reveal existing inequalities between men and women and their relations with the components of biodiversity, and bring into focus their respective knowledge and their different roles and perspectives. Therefore, if possible, it would be important to include data and information that is disaggregated by sex. So this slide includes a non-exhaustive list of the type of data and information that could be included in the stock-taking and assessment, such as data on how men and women access, use, and depend on biological resources, the extent to which men and women share in the benefits derived from biological resources, patterns and changes in the sustainability of activities carried out by women and men, and assessments on the level of gender mainstreaming in past and present initiatives for all sectoral and cross-cutting conservation strategies. Next slide, please. So after the stock-taking and assessment, the next step is to conduct gender-responsive participatory process for the development of the national strategy. So this will help us to understand the kinds of activities that are carried out by women and men, the needs and interests from women, and their knowledge. Next slide, please. So stakeholder engagement, who should be involved? As we can see, this slide provides a non-exhaustive list of key stakeholders that should be involved in the process of developing the national strategy. The list includes representatives from NGOs and CSOs, research and academia, relevant organizations, and the private sector. Next slide. Here, I'd like to share a checklist for ensuring gender-responsive participation, and these are guiding questions to assess gender-responsive participation in the development of the national strategy. As previously discussed, ensuring gender balance and identifying relevant stakeholders are both important. However, having women in the room won't necessarily ensure their effective participation. For example, some women might find it difficult to speak out in front of male relatives or colleagues, or might not be willing to discuss issues in public. It's also important to remember that household duties and childcare are often assigned to women, which could make it difficult for them to participate in meetings. Therefore, participatory techniques require equity measures that can help with delivering gender-responsive participation. And in this way, the role of the facilitator is key to ensure that the diverse stakeholders can present their views and participate in the discussions in a way that is appropriate to the local and the national context. For example, in Nepal, separate groups were organized for women and men to ensure their effective participation in the NBSAP development process. Next slide, please. So this checklist can help to ensure gender-responsive representation of women at regional workshops. And these guiding questions might be useful to consider to ensure that relevant stakeholders are involved, that equity measures are in place, and that the views from the diverse stakeholders are reflected in the text of the document. Next slide. So in terms of finalizing the national strategy, here is an overview of what would be expected to be included in the final strategy from a gender perspective, based on the steps outlined earlier. So the first one is a gender analysis or assessment as part of the stocktake, inclusion of the views and contributions from women and gender experts in the text, that the strategy addresses gender equality issues, and that sex disaggregated data is used, for example, within each sectoral policy strategy, and that capacity building needs related to gender equality are outlined. Next slide, please. So now we'll take a look at the action plan, the process and content of the action plan. So in the process of developing the action plan, it's important to ensure that gender experts are included in the planning team, that women's needs and interests are reflected in the priority setting. It's important to make gender equality a prerequisite for programs and projects, to have gender responsive stakeholder participation and gender balance in the project staff, and that financial resources for addressing gender equality have been adequately allocated. Next slide, please. So in terms of the content of the action plan, the following should be considered. Firstly, to include actions that will help to achieve Target 22 and 23 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Another consideration is for gender equality to be reflected in the context, the activities, and the relevant institutions identified to support with implementation. And also considerations regarding timeframes and budgets for these activities should be included in the plan. Next slide, please. Now, regarding gender responsive monitoring, evaluation, and reporting, from a gender perspective, it will be important that gender objectives and actions reflected in the NBSAP are monitored and reported on. And this may require adapting monitoring systems to ensure the collection of sex disaggregated data and the development and use of gender-specific indicators. Next slide. So in terms of the expected outcomes, gender-responsive NBSAPs will help to empower and position women as agents of change. And these are some of the expected outcomes from this. The provision of capacity building for women, activities to address gender equality within sectoral strategies, progress towards the achievement of Target 23 and Target 22, equal participation and representation of women and men in decision-making processes at all levels, revision of discriminatory laws, for example, related to land tenure, and women and men ultimately benefit equally from activities and programs. Next slide, please. So as noted earlier in this presentation, we tried to summarize some of the key information from documents and guidance available on the CBD website. And we invite you to read these documents to gain further understanding, as well as learn from best practices and examples from countries. And on the last slide are the contact details for the team in case you have any further questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kira, for your presentation. So if you have any questions, my colleague Kira is here to answer them. I think that's the spirit of a webinar, to have the technical team and colleagues and experts alive to solve all your questions and have this dialogue. So please raise your hand and or question your type your question in the chat. Remember that anyway, at the end of all the presentation, we will have this Q&A session, right? So if you have a question, please do not hesitate to raise your hand or type in the chat. Looks like so far we don't have any question, but I have one, Kira, that's better to ask you now to don't lose the momentum, and it's so specific. So how can countries address data gaps related to gender biodiversity? These are key data gaps that might not be ready and available for the NBSAP update. So maybe you can give us more details about it.
Yeah, thanks, Cassandra. And I think this really kind of speaks to one of the challenges that we are facing with the process. And it is a known challenge that there are gender biodiversity data gaps that exist in all countries of the world. But perhaps a good starting point is to acknowledge these gaps in the NBSAP and provide specific actions in the action plan to address the data gaps. I think a lot of this also comes back to, you know, the types of stakeholders and experts that we're involving in this process, and tapping into existing networks and bringing in those institutions where, you know, data collection is already happening and mobilizing that data to be used for the planning and implementation of NBSAPs. I hope that answers the question for you.
Yes, totally. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kira, and the rest of participants. Then we will have this Q&A session where you can ask more to Kira, who is happy to answer your questions during the session. So now let's continue to the next presentation, on adopting a human rights-based approach to NBSAP revision, given by Benjamin Schachter, a human rights officer at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. So the floor is yours, Benjamin.
Thank you, Cassandra, and to all the UN colleagues working in the context of the Early Action Support Project for the opportunity to join here today and to collaborate with you all in that important work. I want to start by highlighting, that I think a lot of the key elements in terms of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and gender equality have been covered in the excellent presentations made so far. I'll try not to repeat too much, and I'll try to focus specifically on a couple of pieces of analysis and guidance that OHCHR, along with other partners, has helped to develop. I want to actually kick things off with a quote from the High Commissioner. So next slide, please. Volker Turk, who's the current High Commissioner for Human Rights, has described the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution as the biggest threat to humankind we have ever seen, noting it imperils our survival and that of future generations. This is an absolute priority for our office. Right now, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights, and that's a year-long campaign. There will be a specific spotlight month on right to a healthy environment and including issues related to climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution in the month of November. And it's this triple planetary crisis that forms the overarching lens of our approach, right? The issues that we are trying to address. And I think it's really important to recognize that these are all connected. Biodiversity loss is linked with climate change and pollution. And the right to a healthy environment offers the roadmap and framework for addressing this crisis in the most effective way and in a way that protects both people and the planet. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to say a few words about the impact of biodiversity loss on human rights. As you all know, biodiversity is an integral part of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So that's a clear area or right that is impacted by biodiversity loss. But all rights are interconnected, and we know that a wide range of human rights are particularly impacted by biodiversity loss, including the rights to life, health, culture, development, non-discrimination, adequate food, and water. Next slide. This slide just lists essentially those rights, maybe a couple I didn't say yet. But it's an illustration of a few of the rights that are affected by biodiversity loss. And it's the widespread impacts of biodiversity loss on human rights that draws us to work on and try to address these issues, including in the context of the development of national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Next slide, please. So we started in this area by conducting an analysis of NBSAPs. And that analysis took essentially the national biodiversity strategies and action plans that were current through 2021. So 186 NBSAPs, and looked at how well they had integrated human rights. And unfortunately, they hadn't for the most part. And we took those findings and thought, well, first of all, the negotiations of what's now called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework are going to be critical to how future NBSAPs are designed. And second of all, the UN system should be prepared with guidance on integrating rights in NBSAPs, because following the adoption at COP15 of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, there's an expectation that NBSAPs will be revised to align with the goals and targets of the framework. Next slide, please. So the guidance that OHCHR supported the development of is guidance that was developed through a collaborative process led by the UN Environment Management Group, Issue Management Group on Human Rights and Environment. UNEP and UNDP and OHCHR co-lead the Issue Management Group, but it includes essentially all UN agencies and some additional intergovernmental organizations and large entities like IUCN. So we developed that guidance through that group in order to ensure it was really comprehensive and reflected well a UN system-wide approach, and also would have UN system-wide ownership. And the objectives included, supporting UN country teams, policymakers, and stakeholders, clarifying how human rights can be integrated into NBSAPs. One of the reasons human rights aren't well integrated is often just a lack of expertise. So with that guidance, we're hoping to address this gap. Currently, the guidance is published on the UN EMG-IMG website. It is also should be available on the website of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. It was submitted to the Secretariat for informational purposes in advance of CBD COP15. And I will share a link later, Maria. When I'm done talking, I'm not good at multitasking, but I'll make sure you get that link. Right now it's being updated through a peer review process, which was initiated by the CBD Secretariat. So the Secretariat of the CBD sent the guidance for comments to member states and observers, and we're in the process of updating and improving it even further, and we'll issue that revised guidance as soon as we can. So next slide, please. I think we've heard already about the interlinkages between the CBD and human rights frameworks. I do just want to highlight that human rights are reflected throughout the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, including in the considerations for implementation, as well as in a number of the specific targets. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass this one in the interest of time. Next slide, please. And here, just to highlight maybe a couple of the key points about the importance of integrating rights in NBSAPs. The human rights framework addresses not just the obligations of states, but also the responsibilities of businesses. Application of a rights-based approach ensures that processes to develop plans, policies, programs, and actions to protect biodiversity are participatory and reflect human rights. It ensures that people who are disproportionately affected by biodiversity loss have a voice in the process, and their rights are protected in the process. And basically, there are a number of key elements like that are the reasons we need to see rights-based approach reflected. And it's not just OHCHR saying this, it's in fact the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecoservices and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that have stated that rights-based approaches lead to more effective and sustainable outcomes in the long term. So it's a matter of legal compliance. It's also a matter of good policy. Next slide, please. So first, the first space we want to talk about human rights in the context of NBSAPs is actually in their development and preparation, right? The process for elaborating a national biodiversity strategy and action plan should be inclusive and participatory. Next slide. The guidance, and basically the next slides will just take you through different elements of the guidance, and I won't cover all of these points again in the interest of time, but some of the elements of the guidance are reflected in these slides, and there's even more information and more suggestions about how to integrate rights in national biodiversity strategies and action plans in the full text, which I'll share in the chat later. So some general ways to integrate human rights in NBSAPs is to ensure that they reference relevant international human rights obligations and standards, that they reflect the duty of state to regulate public and private actors, again, this point about businesses, that they describe the state as a duty bearer that has obligations related to specific human rights, and the development and implementation of the NBSAP, that they elaborate on efforts to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Next slide. That they address issues related to communities that are disproportionately affected by biodiversity loss and related to poverty alleviation and just transition, and that they integrate the duty, so there's a human rights obligation to cooperate and mobilize resources to address the harms caused by biodiversity loss and to prevent them, and so ergo to prevent biodiversity loss itself. Next slide. So we talk a little bit more about environmental governments, and I've essentially already covered this piece. So just to highlight again that it's both the process for developing the NBSAP as well as the processes which the NBSAP creates, right? The content of the NBSAP, its monitoring and its implementation should all advance participation, inclusion, and access to justice, so on. Next slide. We've talked about this a bit already too, the importance of the NBSAP addressing and identifying measures to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of people in vulnerable situations who are disproportionately impacted by biodiversity loss and the degradation of ecosystems. So in particular, the GBF identifies the need to secure access to information, participation, and access to justice for Indigenous peoples, local communities, women and girls, children and youth, and persons with disabilities. So that's just one example of something that should be clearly reflected in the NBSAP. Next slide. Again, I think this is something I've covered to an extent already. As those of you familiar with the CVD know, the rights of Indigenous peoples are an important part of the discussion, and Indigenous peoples are really critical actors in the context of the negotiations. And there are a number of ways that's reflected in the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, including with respect to language and targets 3, 21, 22, so on and so forth, protecting their rights to lands, resources, territories, traditional knowledge, and so on. And this should be reflected in NBSAPs. Next slide. So children and youth, again, there's specific human rights obligations related to children and the environment, which are found in the D, as well as in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So cultural rights, the right to an education with respect for nature, and more recently, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has adopted a general comment on children's rights in the environment, which focuses more on these specific obligations to children related to the environment. And all of these obligations should be reflected in an NBSAP. Next slide. Environmental human rights defenders are absolutely critical to the protection of biodiversity. And unfortunately, there are amongst the human rights defenders that are most at risk. They are frequently the subject of persecution, extrajudicial killings, harassment, and we can't protect biodiversity unless we protect them. Which is reflected in Target 22 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which explicitly calls for protection of EHRDs. Next slide. Business and human rights, we've covered, or I've covered already. Just to flag, the guidance includes specific ideas about how to integrate the responsibility of businesses to address biodiversity loss and the human rights harms related to it in the context of their action. Next slide. Finally, this point of implementation and monitoring of NBSAPs. As I've said before, the whole process should be participatory and inclusive. It should involve people who are affected by biodiversity loss, and also those who might be affected by efforts to protect biodiversity in a way that is meaningful and inclusive. And the monitoring framework is an important part of how we ensure that decision-making is evidence-based, that there's a transparent process for decision-making, and it's something that OHCHR is following closely, including with one of my colleagues who works on indicators, serving on the ad hoc technical expert group, working on further elaboration of the monitoring framework for the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And I think that's it. So next slide is contact information, and thank you very much. Sorry if I've been a bit long. Look forward to any questions.
Okay. It's okay. Thank you, Benjamin, for this interesting presentation. So if you have any question, my colleague Benjamin is here, so please raise your hand or add your question in the chat. Thank you very much, Lauren Sampson, for your questions, and Cristina Sopos for your responses, and Maria Gonzalez, we're asking you, Benjamin, to drop the link of the guidance. So he will do it in a minute, Maria. And so far, it looks like we don't have further questions, but I have one maybe for you to go give us deeply information about including how can human rights mechanisms, including national human rights institutions, do to support implementation of the NBSAPs. Even though you already explained a bit, maybe you can go in detail to participants.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Cassandra. So there are a wide range of different types of human rights mechanisms, some of which are directly supported by OHCHR and some of which are independent, like national human rights institutions, which are independent organs created by governments to support mainstreaming of human rights at the national level. And basically, I think there's an important role for all of them to play. The special procedures of the Human Rights Council are experts appointed by the Council to work on specific human rights issues. So, for example, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples have issued thematic reports related to biodiversity. and including one by the SR on Indigenous peoples, to the upcoming session of the Council, which looks at issues related to conservation finance. The Special Rapporteur on Environment was taking part in the negotiations last year of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and issued a series of reports relevant to those negotiations in the lead up. So those independent experts have an important role to play. The human rights treaty bodies have also played a key role, and I mentioned earlier the work of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, in particular with respect to children's rights and the environment, and then national human rights institutions, because of their mandate, can play an important role in providing direct technical support and advice to the governments that they work with, as well as in receiving, in some cases, depending on their exact mandate, in receiving complaints or petitions from people in the country that they cover, related to issues around biodiversity loss and conservation. So I think it's important to think of these entities all as potential contributors to the monitoring framework, as well as mechanisms for ratcheting up ambition and accountability for human rights harms related to biodiversity loss. Thanks.
Thank you, Benjamin. We are having a couple of more questions from Ms. Kire, who asked you, I think, for this important presentation. Thanks for this important presentation. Did I read that the monitoring and evaluation framework has not been finalized at COP15 and will be finalized in the forthcoming COP16?
Yeah, so that's correct. The monitoring and evaluation framework was not finalized at COP15. There were a number of headline indicators that were agreed to, but even those headline indicators, often with the caveat that they required further elaboration. And there's a real gap in the sense that there are not strong, right now, there are not strong indicators related to many of the targets that are most directly relevant to human rights, or that cover human rights elements of those targets. And C, right, considerations for implementation of the agreement isn't really covered by the indicators framework. And so there's an ongoing discussion amidst the ad hoc technical expert group about how to potentially address some of these issues, and OHCHR is working hard to push for, a few different things, right? I mean, one thing which is very important from a human rights perspective is disaggregation of data according to impacts on people with sort of protected status in different ways. And another piece is actually ensuring that there are indicators for some of these things, like protection of environmental human rights defenders, that are adopted within the overarching indicators framework. The other effective mechanisms for conservation is a tricky one too, and that has substantial human rights implications particularly when thinking about the rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands, resources, and territories. Just if I can jump to that other second question on information on participation of Indigenous peoples in existing MBSAPs, that is not something that we have, OHCHR has specifically analyzed. I made some general points about the need for the process of elaborating new indicators elaborating new MBSAPs to conform with international human rights standards, and that would, of course, include adequate consultation and the meaningful, informed, and effective participation of Indigenous peoples, as well as their free, prior, informed consent related to matters that affect them. So I think it's very important that work be done in this area, but NBSAP development is a national prerogative, right? So it need to be done sort of in a country by country basis. And perhaps there are some ways to also send the right signal and send guidance through the global process and the negotiations in that direction. Certainly, the Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework sends those signals with a number of references to the rights of Indigenous peoples. Thanks.
Yes, Benjamin and Ms. Curie is saying, but the SCBD experts are telling us in different occasions that we must use the global headline indicators during revision of our NBSAPs. Does that mean we have to wait till COP16 for that to happen?
So there was an agreement on these global headline indicators. So I think, or at least the vast majority of them. So I think that can be a basis for NBSAP development, and it should be reflected there. But the reality is that the entire, indicators or monitoring and evaluation framework was not agreed. And there's an ongoing discussion and this ad hoc technical expert group to make recommendations rather that hopefully would be adopted at CBD COP16. But I certainly think the idea is, maybe the sequencing isn't perfect, but these things can't wait either, right? And so I think the idea is probably to work with what's there already, and in NBSAP, right, is very much a national prerogative. So you can take what's there and make it better by filling in those gaps related to human rights indicators, and OHCHR is happy to provide some support in that respect.
Thank you, Benjamin. So thank you, all of you, also for your questions. And remember that at the end, also, we will have a few minutes to open the discussion. Let's continue with our last presentation on incorporating consideration of a local action and a whole society approach, given by Dr. Terence Eddy, Program Manager at the Global ICCIA Support Initiative. So remember that at the end of his presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask some questions in the chat or raise your hand. So over to you, Terence.
Thank you so much. I'm still using my phone. My computer is still updating, so I'll not turn on my video. So just to start by saying I'll try to not repeat what other speakers have already mentioned. But to say, of course, that NBSAPs, there have been various earlier rounds over the last 3 decades of the whole NBSAP process. And so one of the questions now is what is most relevant with the current updates. And coming out of the GEF assembly, which happened last week, the GEF is the funder of the Early Action Support grant. There has been a particular focus on, sorry, my computer is, all right, I'm on my computer now.
Yes,
So,
but we can hear some echo.
Okay.
Let's try again. Yes.
it should be fine now. I turned off.
Yes. Great.
So,
Thank you, Terence.
So yes, I'll talk a little bit about the scale question of when we talk about the whole of society approach, how some of the pathways for that. So the next slide, please. So the element around the inclusivity and the whole of society approach has been a particular focus of the GEF CEO, who has last week been emphasizing this in terms of the GEF-8 and the GEF-9 replenishment. In the build up to the COP15 in Montreal last year, we saw this huge number of publications and various advocacy frameworks around including human rights in the framework. This started, one of the key events was in 2020 with the UN General Assembly's session on biodiversity, and which called for a fundamental reimagining of how conservation is carried out. So you see there some of the key advocacy documents which were prepared by a range of NGOs and human rights organizations. Next slide, please. So so that's Ben on the stage in Montreal with a number of the key partners from BirdLife, from different CSO networks, presenting the new developments from 2021 and 22 on the right to a healthy, clean and sustainable environment, and what the implications are for the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity agreement. Next slide, please. So this coming up to 2023, UNDP, UNEP, and the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights prepared the information note you see on the left, which has an overview of key elements of this right. And on the right, you see there some of the special rapporteurs. And so we've seen in the last 3 years and a further elaboration of the range of specializations. So beyond the focus of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, David Boyd, top right, we have other special rapporteurs focusing on sub-areas around toxics and climate change. So a further specialization. So in a sense, the R2HE, as it's referred to, is in a sense, an overarching right within which other rights are folded into that. Next slide, please. So just to recap a little bit on what was mentioned earlier, some of the key elements for NBSAPs on the left-hand side obviously include ministries most directly working on environment, but not only those, but actually others that are impacting the environment. So sometimes those would not necessarily be thought of as the first actors to be involved, but unless there's and this comes back to the whole of society approach and the way in which coherence is to be achieved across the different parts of government, these different government as well as non-governmental actors and institutions need to be involved. And it's worth noting that the GEF CEO in Costa Rica has his background was Minister of the Environment, and he very often notes how little, to some extent, the GEF is able to reach beyond the Ministry of Environment. So how ministries of environment and agriculture and mining and transportation and so on work together, it will be key to having an effective NBSAP. On the right-hand side, you see some of the groups we've talked about already, but I think just to maybe emphasize that the role of when we say private sector, it's often you have to unpack that a little bit and think about all the different aspects of the way in which finance and fiscal policies impact the environment. So including the banks and of course banks, that includes a range of institutions from international investors, pension funds, as well as in the insurance sector, right the way down to more local level finance. increasingly we're seeing in the GBF a call for an alignment of philanthropy in the new Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. So next slide, please. So now, this is just one slide I have to re-emphasize the importance of the 2019 report of the IPBES, which concluded that one of the most viable pathways for biodiversity conservation in the long term was the coexistence of human beings in landscapes with nature. Human beings are part of nature. This is applicable both to connectivity as much as to the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities that are even enhancing biodiversity. So this notion that it's not the 30 by 30 target is not about setting aside land as free of, empty of human beings, but the land sharing principle that human beings can improve, coexist, and enhance biodiversity conservation. And we see that in the new GBF action agenda for nature and people. So next slide, please. So now I'm going to move and talk a little bit about this scale question for the whole of society approach. So I just mentioned connectivity and human beings within broader territorial and landscape approaches. This really depends on how these areas are governed, and we've seen particularly in the work of the IUCN around protected and conserved areas, a focus on the different diverse and forms of governance. Next slide, please. So just here, there's not enough time to go into each one of these elements, but landscape approaches are something that we see discussed across many different UN fora. So both within the CBD, there have been over the last 10 years, a series of partnerships and guidance frameworks. And I think from this webinar, there'll be some of the publications which are referred to on the right made available, particularly the one from the UNU International Institute of Advanced Studies, and the Satoyama Initiative, which started in 2010. Some of the participants may have been there in Nagoya. But also we see other conventions. So the UNCCD, the work on restoration, there's a focus there around aggregation of activities at a landscape and seascape level. In the UNFCCC, under the UN RED framework, as well as the LULUCF, under the Food System Summit, and then within the GEF, similarly, into the GEF-8 replenishment, the work on the interface between drylands and the UN Decade on restoration. I'll say a little bit more about now. I'll move on to an example around the work of UNDP with the Satoyama Initiative. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot from the UNU guidance on landscape and seascape approaches for the whole of society approach. Essentially, the idea being that a landscape is a mosaic of different patterns of land use, and with a particular overarching framework, this can be reoriented towards a more nature positive, a balance of different interests. So next slide, please. So these are just resources from the webinar. On the bottom left, there's a video and a link to the UNU guidance. Other guidance has been provided, particularly from the government of the Netherlands, which has been working on transformative landscape governance. Next slide, please. And so within these collaborative area-based approaches, there is an interest to explore the linkages between urban and rural areas, so that the impact, the footprint of urban areas can also be taken into consideration when preparing an NBSAP. So next slide, please. Just to recap, to say that, of course, if a country is relatively small, the whole of society approach could be done at the national level. But when we're thinking about very large countries, this essentially becomes, from a scale perspective, more challenging. So in the SBSTA negotiations in 2022, there were some focused side events last year where countries like such as India were discussing how at a state or provincial level NBSAPs can be created for a particular province. And so here on the slide, you see some of the first steps which have already been touched upon around convening of the stakeholders around particular goals. And next slide, please. So then where that then leads is we've talked about some of the indicators which are still being developed under the ATEG for the GBF. But essentially, an NBSAP is an iterative learning process. So as commitments are identified, the application of those targets within particular sectors and geographies can be applied. So here, I'll give an example in a second of how this has been done in a number of countries through a partnership between UNDP and the COMDEX initiative of the government of Japan's Satoyama initiative. Next slide, please. So this was launched. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this was launched back in around 2010 in Nagoya to look at how biodiversity conservation at a landscape and seascape scale can be achieved. It's been applied in 20 countries. You see in 4 phases. And key elements of this have been around the way in which now increasingly there's a discussion around circularity, circular economy can be integrated within the multi-actor framework within the CEPL's approach. Next slide, please. And in this instance, it involved the use of small grants to incentivize and to build the shared governance at that territorial scale, linking both the protection of ecosystem services with production systems, livelihoods, and decision making, as covered by the target 22, which have been touched upon earlier. Next slide, please. So these are some of the resource documents which summarize the experience for the COMDEX initiative over the last 12 years. And so those indicators explore a range of different elements, including the traditional knowledge of landscape resilience and sustainability. Next slide, please. So I think I have one more slide. This one I included mainly to focus on the question of the appropriate scale when we're talking about whole of society. So in this instance, this is Ghana. It could have been Bhutan or Mongolia or Niger or the other countries that participated. The actors at the country level focused on a particular landscape or seascape to build the multi-actor framework for the whole of society engagement. And so in this instance, it was a landscape called the Weto landscape you see on the top left there in Ghana, where all these different approaches to build the relationships between the municipal government, civil society, NGOs, the private sector happened at that scale. And this, if it's demonstrated in one particular subnational process, can then inform and enhance similar planning frameworks elsewhere. And this has been a particular focus of the GEF CEO going into the GEF-9 replenishment, where he sees even the GEF finance flowing to mayors and to subnational actors as part of these territorial approaches. I think this is my last slide. If you can move to the last. Okay, this is the last one. So this is just to say that within the GBF targets 1, 2, and 3, which are all 3 of them area-based approaches, we see this relationship between the target 1 on the spatial planning and target 3, which is often talked about in terms of the 30 by 30, whereby, and we talked earlier about the fact that many of these landscapes, people are living in them, and then the relationship to target 2, which is essentially one of a restorative vision to restore connectivity and enhance restoration and ecological processes to improve nature conservation. And just on the right there, you see some of the guidance that IUCN has produced over the last 4 years since the COP14 in Egypt in relation to other effective area-based conservation measures, which OECMs which look beyond just protected and conserved areas at the way in which de facto conservation is happening in landscapes through other institutional arrangements. I think this is the last slide. So yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, back to you, Cassandra.
Thank you very much, Terence, for this presentation. So as we did before, you can raise your hand or type your question in the chat. Please don't be shy. I think that's the spirit of a webinar. Like, all the technical experts are here to talk with you alive, so we can open a discussion. And also, if you don't have any question for Terence, but you missed to ask a question to the other presenters, please, is the moment to do it. We have some time before the ending of the session. In the meantime, and maybe Christina, do you want to give further details of the responses that you keep in the chat, or is okay?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you for these informative presentations. I think it would be helpful just if I could briefly respond to the question in the chat about the project's expectations around human rights, and then I can turn it back over to Terence for these other questions, because I think we find if one person has a question, a lot of people do as well. So the question relates to did the GEF-EAS project focus change, and is it different from the commitment we all have to align national targets with the GBF? And then the question goes on to note that the log frame for the project notes best practices in gender mainstreaming, stakeholder engagement, involvement of MyPLCs, and a whole of government approach should be considered and nothing more, and ask for clarifications. And so let me offer this. So the project document was written in advance of the COP last year to ensure that all governments had funding by the close of the COP to begin their NBSAP work, try to accelerate policy cycles. There's overwhelming feedback in the last decade that one of the limitations was that GEF funding wouldn't be received until about a year after the COP closure. So it is correct that the PRODOC was developed and approved before the COP. The project outcomes and activities have not changed. The purpose, the project outcome number 1 is that NBSAPs are ready to be aligned, and that national biodiversity targets are aligned with the post-2020 global biodiversity framework by the end of this project. And that is done by undertaking a rapid review of the NBSAP with your stakeholder groups, determining where new targets need to be taken on board, where there are gaps, and then making sure that they're operational, and then at least having a plan to update the full NBSAP by 2 COPs from now, if not by the end of this COP. What is different, and the focus of this webinar, is this emphasis on human rights and gender that emerged during the dialogue at the COP, and that is now embedded within the framework. So with this webinar, we really wanted to pull together some experts, and then I also wanted to highlight how human rights considerations are embedded within the project within the work of the implementing agencies so that you can take these considerations into account during target revision, because this is one of the most fundamental opportunities we have to embed this human rights work into our work, reflective of the GBF and its considerations, which I outlined at the front of the project. There is no addendum to the project document. These are just considerations we hope you will take into account as you form your stakeholder committees and advance the work of the targets, because the GBF is not just focused on biodiversity, but also these other considerations as well. I hope that clarification is helpful. And please always be in touch if you have any questions about the project implementation.
Thank you, Christina. So I don't know if there are more questions for the presenters. Please take the advantage that they are here. Christina, Terence, Benjamin, Kira. Anyway, it's a reminder that we will upload this document with the Q&A in the webinar webpage, where you can have access to also to the links that, for example, Benjamin just provided to Maria, and all the resources that we are sharing in addition to the presentations and recordings that will be available in the webinar webpage. So it looks like we don't have further questions. So with that, we are at the end of this session. Thank you very much for your active participation. I want to thank you, all of you, representatives from government and country offices, for your time. Before concluding this meeting, I would like to express a thanks to the GEF for providing the funds for this project, and our partners at UNEP, WCMC, and CBD for all the joint work in this GEF project. But particularly many thanks for the agencies that are here today, the WCMC, and also the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights and the UNDP for your presentations and for further discussions. You saw, I think, in the previous slides, the emails of the presenters. You can take a screenshot. And also we will share with you all this information afterwards in an email. And you can find, as I said before, the recordings, presentations, and the Q&A document in our webinar webpage that my colleague Maya dropped again the link in the chat. So the upcoming webinar, which is the webinar 5 in our series, how fast passed the year, right? And will be the week of the 18th of September, about national target alignment, tools and technical support. We will send you further information by email soon. And then finally, at the end of the session, you will receive a quick survey, which will take you 1 minute to respond. We really appreciate your feedback to continue offering good quality webinars as the capacity building deliverables in the early action support project. So we'll look forward to continue to work with you in this important project. And thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lauren, for your message too in the chat. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, everybody, so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.